And me and my brother were the only Muslim men on the delegation, and we were pulled aside. Women were too. We were kept the longest, and it wasn't easy. And when I remember two things that really stood out to me. Was when the official from the U.S. Embassy came, because of course we had official diplomatic letters and letters of support, according to Dianne Feinstein, who's still the senator of California, Knesset members, I think the Knesset member's name is Yossi Sarid, in Israel, for the delegation. So the U.S. Embassy official shows up and asks me, he's waiting for me outside, and he asks me, how can I help you? And I said, well, I'm not sure that you can. I said, but I would like to ask you, why do you think this is happening? And his answer to me, and I quote, was, I'm sure it has something to do with your racial and ethnic makeup. Right? And this is the American embassy speaking to me. And I was traveling on my U.S. passport. And according to the laws and the diplomatic relationships between Israel and the U.S., this shouldn't be a problem, but it was in this case, and as I'll talk about subsequently for others as well. Second issue that I wanted to speak about that experience had to do with while I was inside and was detained and being questioned for hours, there was an elder Palestinian man who also tried to come through Tel Aviv, and apparently had done so before, but he might have been like in his early 70s. And he was coming back from out of the country, or out of Palestine, and he had brought gifts for his family. And I just saw the ways in which the Israeli officials who were searching his bags were so hostile and even violent, physically violent toward this elder man, hitting him with their rifle butts. He spoke Hebrew. They would ask him a question at first, he spoke Arabic. They said, we couldn't understand you. He said, okay, then I'll speak in Hebrew. He started speaking in Hebrew, and they started hitting this 70-year-old man with the butt of their rifles, saying, you're a dog, don't speak our language. And so here he was in this place where he is being physically assaulted, but he's not able to communicate. In fact, he's not allowed to communicate. And for me, it became a kind of metaphor for thinking about the relationship that's structured between Israelis and Palestinians. He wanted to communicate, but he wasn't allowed to, right? And during a period when we were sitting there together, there was several lulls in our, one time we were together, he sat and he looked at me, I just sat there next to him, and he asked me, he said, what are you doing? I said, well, I came to see what's happening. I want to understand it in a different way. And he just looked at me straight in broken English, but he was able to say it. He said, you shouldn't come here. He said, this is no place for human beings. And so that experience really marked me in particular ways, but it was really revealing. I learned a lot. And so while I didn't get in, so to speak, to see what I had hoped for and intended to see, I still learned a lot from the experiences I had went through. And I say that because, recently, it came back more recently. There's a bill in Congress right now that's trying to be passed, where the U.S. and Israel are trying to establish a relationship with each other that's going to now allow Israelis to come to the U.S. and not need a visa. No visa needed. You're Israeli, you just come pick them up at the airport, you're good to go. Nothing, no prior approval. But the holdup is the Israeli side of it. The U.S. asks for mutuality in this situation. If the United States allows a country, the United States has a relationship with 38 other countries, I think, in this way. It allows nationals from another country who come to the U.S. to not need a visa. But the mutuality has to be there. There has to be reciprocity. That means U.S. nationals have to be allowed into those countries without a visa. Right? Israel is the only country asking for an exemption. The only country asking for an exemption. And they're asking for an exemption, right? Because they're concerned about Arab and Muslim-looking people who hold U.S. passports. They see them as threats to the state of Israel. And so in many ways, within the way in which the law is being haggled over at this point, they're structuring this kind of hierarchy amongst citizenship when it comes to entry into the state of Israel between those who are Arab and Muslim and those who are not, right? And this is being haggled over now in Congress, and there's, different debates around it, but it's something that's on the table right at this moment. And the State Department even released a statement. I was just going to quote it. He said, the State Department in its Israel Travel Advisory warns, quote, that, quote, it's the U.S. State Department, U.S. citizens whom Israeli authorities suspect of being Arab, Middle Eastern, or of Muslim origin may be denied entry or exit without explanation. End quote. So this is the State Department recognizing what this situation is about. And so I kind of wanted to give you a personal anecdote about my experience trying to get in and why I was not allowed to. And then kind of give you a sense of how today it's almost seeking to become official policy, right? And I do that because, and I want to, I want to throw maybe a couple more ideas out there, and then we can have some Q&A. But I want to reference an article, and I know Robin is familiar with him and his work. Bill Mullen, who's a professor at the University of Purdue, who wrote a piece a few months ago, several months ago, and he argued that Palestine was the most dialectical place in the world. But what he was arguing was that it captures the global imagination in the way that no other space in the world has today, right? That it's a space of where cross-currents and tensions, contradictions, and overlaps occur along various struggles, right? He argued that, like Algeria before it, right, in the 50s and early 60s, for those of you taking my classes, you know about Algeria and the Battle of Algiers, that like Algeria before it, Palestine today is that symbol of kind of a particular kind of global resistance, right? And as I talked about, even in my own research, the way in which Algeria for Malcolm X, for the Black Panther Party, and for a whole host of third world revolutionaries, Algeria became this symbol, right, of a particular kind of solidarity, right? And Mullen argued that Palestine today is that same thing, that through Palestine we can see questions around labor, we can see questions around incarceration, war and occupation, settler colonialism and conquest, right? And so I want us to begin to think about the ways in which Palestine can be used in a particular way, in a productive way, for how we can think about struggles taking place in other parts of the world too. Because if we want to start drawing parallels, and I understand the limitations of drawing parallels, but that's why they're parallels, because they actually never cross, right? But they're parallels. Parallels are important because if we want to think about incarceration, we should also then think about how that operates here in the United States. What is the system of mass incarceration about? If we want to think about the question of settler colonialism, right, and the settlers that exist today, Irvine is a settlement. Chicago is a settlement. We have to talk about questions of indigenous rights here, right? We have to talk about occupation here, right? So while it's important for us to think about Palestine as this dialectical space, we don't have to look too far to think about how the forces that are happening in Palestine are operating in different ways here. I mean, just about 100 miles south of here is the most militarized border in the world, the U.S.-Mexico border. Many of the same companies doing the work there. Many of the drones, the ones who built the wall, the whole military infrastructure, and satellite and surveillance that are guarding the United States along the US-Mexico border, quote unquote, are similar to what's happening either with the wall or the architecture of kind of apartheid that is being built in Israel and Palestine. And so what I want us to do, and we can get into this more in the Q&A, is to begin to think about how we can see analogs for a particular kind of solidarity, right? That, again, aren't necessarily exact, but are made legible when we think about our current space, because very few places in the world, you know, mirror the conditions of Israel and Palestine. Again, there are parallels, Australia as a settler colonial state, and the United States as a settler colonial state. Again, we don't have to go too far to think about what that means. So that when we think about politics for a place way over there, 12,000 miles away, again, we don't have to look too far to think about how we can animate a politics here too. So they're not mutually exclusive, and that we have to see them as relational and connected, right? And so, you know, I want to, you know, and I'll bring this up more, and I think I maybe gone a little over my time, but I really want us to think about, and I think Edward Said becomes this kind of like iconic figure, right? And I know that the Palestinian narrative is a central part of the title for the week, right? But what Said argued for Palestinians in this troubled way was this permission to narrate that he talked about for Palestinians, this permission to narrate, this need, right? For them to speak themselves and write themselves and act themselves into history. Right? We often hear that the Palestinians don't exist, right? Golda Meir's famous claim, or the argument that Israel is a land for what is it, people without a land? It's a land for a people with, how do they call it again? I'm confused. A people without a land, there we go. Right? We often hear that Palestinians are invisible. And Said argued the narrative was a central part of making them visible. Right? And that's what the BDS movement is about. It's about marking visibility in a particular way. And we have to understand, BDS emerged out of Palestine. It didn't emerge out of Europe. It didn't emerge out of the United States. Right? This is part of its power. It emerged out of Palestinian civil society.
Yeah, it does.
And captured the global imagination. You know, that's something that for those of us who are interested in questions of social justice and on the left, we have to claim these victories. These are victories. They might not be transformative now, but they're victories nonetheless. And when we understand them, hopefully we'll get into it in the Q&A, when we understand them, you know, in relationship, for example, to the anti-apartheid struggle or other struggles before it, if we can have that historical perspective, then we can really understand how claiming these victories is vital to kind of a broader and more enduring struggle. All right? So thank you for your time, and hopefully we'll have some Q&A there.
You gotta do it now. Yeah, I'm gonna keep that going.
Thank you, Dr. Galata. So as we kind of get the table centered a little bit on the stage, I just wanted to transition us into the next segment of tonight, which is going to be a moderated Q&A. So we have some prepared questions for our speakers, and we'll go ahead and begin with them as soon as we get this table centered. Sorry about that. So to continue on, we're going to go ahead and begin with the moderated Q&A portion of tonight. And so to begin with, the first question I wanted to kind of address to both of you, which is really important for our campus, particularly this year. Can you expand on your thoughts regarding the rising move on college campuses towards divestment and explain its significance? And this is addressed to both of you.
So the question's about why now, why the interest, what's motivating. Right. Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to answer the question. I mean, I think it's a movement that has been building. And again, this is part of what I was talking about toward the end of my opening remarks about understanding where we can begin to claim victories, right? That this is part of a building, this is part of a movement that has been building over time. And it's culminated in the passing of these resolutions, not only here in the UC system, but across the country and other parts of the world too. I mean, for Stevie Wonder, as problematic as even how he refused, you know, and ended up refusing to participate, but the fact that he felt the kind of pressure to not participate in Israel is indicative again of the power of how this movement has been building, not even since 2005 when the BDS was called, that this is a movement that's been building even before that, right? And so, again, this gets back to, I think, Bill's point about why Palestine is like the most dialectical place in the world. I mean, if you begin to think about the contradictions and even hypocrisies that it exposes around neoliberalism and war, right? And how white supremacy continues to perpetuate itself. If you begin to think about those relationships between those things, right? And the way in which the post 9/11 moment has been so much about that, right? It's kind of reinvigorated in some ways a kind of white supremacy. It reinvigorated a warfare state, right? It reinvigorated particular forms of authoritarianism, right? If you really think about it, and I'm not talking about out there, right? I'm talking about here, right? If you think about the ways in which it animated and reinvigorated all those forces here, you can start to then begin to think about how the issue of Palestine, again, came to sit at this crossroads, right? And so, I mean, I'm sure Dr. Kelly will get into more details about it, but for me, like, these are some of the broader sketches about why I think, you know, the movement has picked up at this point.
Yeah, I would echo all that. I just add a couple other things. One, divestment is a very powerful tool because colleges and universities are corporations. They have billions of dollars tied up in investments, billions, I mean, per university. And one of the important sort of sites of struggle in the 1980s when I was coming up was, of course, South Africa. And, you know, the fact is that the combination of a global divestment movement and a very strong labor movement within South Africa that really brought that country to its knees in terms of its ability to both produce wealth and sell commodities. The combination of those things brought, you know, led to the end of apartheid. And, you know, the difference is, you know, there's a lot, the struggle for divestment with regard to Israel is much more difficult than South Africa. And one of the reasons, there's two reasons why I think this is something worth thinking about. One is that during the anti-apartheid movement, the South African state didn't have a whole lot of agents working very, very hard to lobby, and there was no strong South Africa lobby, right? We didn't have people, you know, like I don't remember people except for the police filming us as we spoke, you know, and stuff like this happens here clearly. That stuff didn't happen. And so that's one factor, but the other factor is that if you think about the economic situation in Palestine and Israel, South Africa had a very strong labor force that South African capital depended on. When they went out and strike, they could shut down the economy. In Gaza, in the West Bank, you're talking about unemployment rates of 70, 80%. You're talking about really undercutting people's livelihood. You're talking about, it's like the Bantustan situation in South Africa, but the vast, vast majority of Palestinians are displaced, dispossessed, and refugees. People living in refugee camps since 1948, let alone 67. So it's a very, very hard struggle, and it's one that can be won, and it will be won, because right now, global opinion is very critical of Israel. And the U.S. is probably underrated in terms of just the national position. And of course, all of you here have kind of, again, led the way in terms of convincing universities, like Berkeley now is on the path, UCLA is on the path.